Good morning. Thank you for being here during this second day of our conference. Some reminders and then we'll start straight away. If you were not here yesterday, it's an international conference. You might hear people speaking in French and in English, but it's interpreted live. There are headsets at the entrance if you want to listen to the interpretation. There's Wi-Fi. The Wi-Fi code is on the paper boards at the entrance, and I can also give it to you now. The Wi-Fi network is Faire Grandir les Enfants, and the password FGE capital letters at 2024. We're going to welcome Nathalie Sejean, who's opening the second day. During her presentation, there is an exercise. You've got pen and papers at the entrance. If you don't have one with you, you don't need to go back to the entrance. There are people in the room who no, there's no more pen and paper. There are 2 pens and 2 pieces of paper. So if there are 2 people who don't have a piece of paper and a pen, then you can let us know. Otherwise, we'll find another way of doing this exercise. So I'm going to give the floor to Nathalie Sejean for the power of stories. If you feel a bit stressed out about the exercise that was mentioned, don't worry. It's not an exercise where there will be right or wrong answers. It's just so that you can participate. And I'll let you know when it starts anyway. Hello, my name is Nathalie Sejean. I was born in Reims and I've been living in Lille for 7 years. But for some time now, I've wanted to move to Brittany, near the sea. And the story doesn't tell us if I'm going to manage to do it. I have 2 nationalities, and so I have a privileged access to 2 cultures, French and Lebanese cultures. I've lived in the United States, Turkey, and Spain. So I've got a bit of a hands-on experience of these 3 cultures. I'm number 4 in a family of 5. I have brothers and sisters. I'm 40 years old and 11 months. And my job is to make up stories. When I say that I make up stories, people usually understand that I tell stories. And sometimes even that I write stories for children, and that's very specific. Because in the collective imagination, when an adult invents the name of his or her profession, that person is a bit eccentric. And if this eccentric person is a woman, usually we imagine that she works with children. So yes, I invented the name of my profession, and yes, I'm a woman. But I don't write tales for children. I make up stories for adults. Telling stories is a way of repeating a story that was made up. Making up a story is the creation of something that didn't exist before. My job consists of taking things that are outside of me and taking things that are inside me, then deconstructing them, combining them, and transforming them to give them a meaning, a form, and emotions. I associate the combination I've created with a medium that can be a film, a book, a podcast, a work of art, a conference, which will enable the story to exist outside of me and be shared with others. This moment we're sharing together is a story I've made to tell you about the power of stories. My medium is air, and my technique is face-to-face orality with a dash of slides. We also call it a conference. Like all stories, this one is made up of 3 elements. What I've decided to tell you, the content, the way I've decided to tell you this story, the style, and everything I'm not telling you, empty space. Because a story is what we name, but it's also what we don't tell, by choice or by forgetfulness, by lack of knowledge or time, or by clumsiness. Whether it is consciously or unconsciously created, these empty spaces also tell stories in the form of innuendo and the unspoken. I'll give you an example of an empty space in a story. Just over ago, I was writing a play with writer-director Élise Mérien. We were in the car talking about the themes of the play, namely the universe and our place as humans in this great evolutionary equation. At the back of the car was Yael, Élise's daughter, who had just turned 8. And she interrupted us to tell us something. She said, "You know, I know who the first human being on Earth was." And so Elise and I were curious because neither of us knew who the first human being on Earth was. Now I know. And I hope to give you the scoop of your day. The first human being on Earth was a man, quite simply. But also, to quote Yael, it makes sense. Because at school, when we show her pictures of the evolution of human beings, it's always a man that we see first, then second and third. Then it's certain that the first human was a man. I knew right away which drawing Yael was talking about. That illustration we see everywhere all the time, but neither Elise nor I had seen this other story told in the empty space of this drawing, which Yael had immediately identified. There are never any women in this drawing, implying that the first human being was a man. This representation of our evolution first appeared in 1965 in a popular science book for young people. The illustration was originally accompanied by a text, and together they formed a story. Over time, it was separated from the text, repeated dozens of times, and became a shorthand for the idea that we evolve. Although it contains several scientific errors, it has been circulated continuously for 6 decades and is engraved in the minds of millions of people. Which brings me to my first point. A story is more powerful than a fact. Some 15 years ago, American researchers set out to understand why we were so permeable to stories. Why would you remember a scientific fact presented in a story better than a scientific fact at all? And what has been revealed is that when you discover a story, your brain synchronizes with the person telling it. In English, we use the term neural coupling. I failed to find a French translation, so I'll translate it here as couplage neuronal, neural coupling. Stories have the power to pollinate our imaginations in profound ways and durable ways. It's the only container in which you can combine facts, knowledge, ideas, and emotions. I try to make myself understood by telling you a story, and you try to understand me by listening to my story. In doing so, our brains synchronize, making the impact of what is shared much more powerful than if I were simply stating facts. We use stories to make sense of the world around us and to understand each other. They create our pasts and enable us to imagine our future. By listening to them, reading them, and seeing them, we draw conclusions, make decisions, and learn. We're here today because we share a common belief in the importance of developing children's intelligence, curiosity, and emotional growth. So we're spending 2 days making and sharing stories that will enrich and strengthen these beliefs. Which brings me to my second point. Everyone's making up stories all the time. When we say stories, we spontaneously think of novels, films, and TV series. But a story can take any form. Stories are narratives, person-to-person offerings to convey messages. Every day, in your personal and professional life, you tell stories. You tell the world around you, and you tell others. You may do so in a more or less developed and controlled way, but you spend your whole time making up little stories with their own content, style, and empty spaces. The world we live in is built on millions of stories that we evolve with us in real time. In other words, stories are one of the most powerful tools we have to bring the world around us to life. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 teachings that I think are essential to know in order to notice, appreciate, and use, if you wish, the power of stories. Lesson number 1, that it's not one story that transforms people, but a message repeated through thousands of stories. Why is that? Because we need repetition to integrate new information, and because you never know what people will remember from a story that you share with them. In other words, the aim is not to create the perfect story that will leave a lasting impression on people's minds, but to clarify the messages we want to convey and then repeat them over and over again in different styles and media. I've lost a piece of paper. Has anyone seen Home Alone 2? It's this film. I saw it when it came out in 1992. And then I saw it again for the second time a month ago in the company of 2 children aged 8 and 10. Before starting the film, I told them that in this story there was a scene that changed my life. The film tells the story of young Kevin McAllister, who finds himself alone in New York during the Christmas holidays, trying to foil a plan by 2 criminals to rob a toy store. Along the way, he meets a wild, homeless woman who feeds pigeons. The pigeon woman explains to Kevin that she wasn't always homeless and wild. She used to have a home, a husband, a job, and then one day he stopped loving her. And she was so heartbroken that after that she didn't dare use her heart and gradually withdrew from the world. Kevin, who's 9 years old, is already quite confident. And he tells her a story. When he was younger, he received a pair of skates for his birthday. And they were so beautiful that he'd only worn them once in his room, then put them away in their box for fear of damaging them. And the day he finally felt ready to use them, he realized he'd grown up and couldn't fit into his skates anymore. At that moment, he realized that if you wait too long to be ready to live, you could miss out on your whole life. In 1992, I'm 9 years old, I'm in the dark at the movies, and my neural coupling is on fire. I took the story of Kevin Skates, I put it in my heart, and for over 2 decades, when I was afraid of experiencing something for fear of being wrong or hurt, I would say to myself, Nathalie, think about Kevin Skates. And then at some point, I finally integrated the message of this story and didn't need to think about it anymore. The message was part of me. This scene, the scene with the woman with the pigeons and Kevin Skates, lasts 1 minute out of a film that lasts 2 hours. Tim and Joseph, the 2 kids, I watched the film again a month ago, spent the 2 hours trying to find the scene that changed my life when I was their age. They couldn't find it because it wasn't the message that they needed today. In my life, there are thousands of stories that thrilled me at the time and that I've never thought about again afterwards, that I've never remembered and that have left no trace. And sometimes there's a detail, a situation, a dialogue that I needed, that I put in my heart and that changed my life. We can't control what people will remember about the stories we share. We all need different things depending on when the stories enter and leave our lives. Not being able to control what people retain from stories doesn't diminish the importance or impact stories can have on us. But it does mean that it's not enough to make one story that works for that story to have power, that you have to repeat your messages through multiple stories and in multiple ways. Lesson number 2 is that to unfold your power or its power, a story needs to survive time. And to survive time, it needs to be shared in a specific way. That specific way is what I call circulation. Circulation is the intentional act of putting a story forward in order to give it a small evolutionary advantage, to use British author Neil Gaiman's expression. Circulation means taking the time to sort through all the content we consume and highlighting what we want to see stay with us over the long term. Circulation means sharing a story by creating a setting for it. In other words, by presenting it in a way that makes others want to go there. Today, there's no shortage of good stories. On the contrary, we have too many to see, too many to read, too many to listen to. We suffer from a problem of abundance. We accumulate, we absorb. What do we do with all this? If I had to, stories have become entertainment content. We consume them, we chain them together to take our minds off things, to pass the time, to get out of the here and now. But the original purpose of stories is to convey messages by activating our imagination. To circulate a story is to transform the too much into less and the less into the precious. It's to share a piece of what you feel is important in your own way to nourish the group's imagination. The circulation of stories that have changed it, well, it's also a muscle that needs to be exercised and requires us to be aware of and choose which stories we want to put forward, and therefore which ones we won't share, because we don't have the space or the time to discover everything, and because we don't need to know everything, we need meaning and direction. And that's precisely what stories allow us to do. On the 29th of April 2023, I received a message from my brother who was sharing a story with me about the origin of the English word treehugger. Today, A tree hugger is a person who is particularly committed to defending forests and ecology. But there's a story behind the choice of words. Begins as follows. In 1730, in the village of Kejali, a desert region of India, hundreds of Bishnois men and women tried to protect the Kejri trees that were about to be cut down to build a palace. Kejri trees are considered sacred by the Bishnois, who place respect for and protection of living beings at the heart of their beliefs. It's also a tree that is all the more precious that it's got an ability to grow in the desert, bringing shade and life in a hostile environment. To prevent the trees in her village from being cut down, one woman, Amrita Devi, and her 3 daughters decided to hug the trees. The soldiers cut off their heads and toppled the trees. The news spread to the surrounding villages, and hundreds of people arrived to protect the trees by hugging them. The soldiers massacred 363 Bishnois. Shocked by the Bishnois' peaceful commitment, the king recalled his troops and issued a decree forbidding the Kejri trees to be cut down. This story has traveled as far as the Himalayas, and almost 250 years later, in 1973, village women created the Chipko movement, Chipko meaning glue pot, and they used the same tactics as the Bishnois, hugging the trees to prevent the commercial exploitation of their forests. The Chipkos succeeded in reforming deforestation policy in the Himalayas. This story has been circulating quite a bit on social networks. You may have seen it. When I read it on my phone, I thought it was great. Then I forgot about it. Last October, 5 months after receiving my brother's message, I listened to an interview with Nobel Prize-winning economist Esther Duflo, who was presenting a series of children's books she has written to explain the issues of extreme poverty to children and to give parents a basis for discussion. During the interview, she mentioned that she was inspired by the story of the Bishnois for one of the books. Esther Duflo decided to circulate this story to give it a little evolutionary edge by making it survive the test of time by repeating a message in a different medium. In doing so, she brought this story to the surface of my memory and gave me the opportunity once again to either forget it or imprint it a little more on myself by circulating it. What is neither mentioned nor used eventually ceases to exist. By telling you this story, I'm helping to keep it alive. Perhaps one of you will be curious enough to go and see where this story stands today among the Bishnois and whether the trees are still protected or threatened again. Perhaps one of you will decide to pass it on and thus continue to give it a small evolutionary advantage, which brings me to the third lesson I'd like to share with you on the power of stories. Stories that survive time from our cultural DNA. Our cultural DNA is that heritage of knowledge, information, and beliefs, infused with stories that we inherit at birth and accumulate as we grow up, in our family, at school, at work, and in the country or countries where we live. Stories are the equivalent of our genes. Just like our biological DNA, cultural DNA adapts to enable us to survive and evolve into our future form. The difference being that cultural DNA changes much more rapidly on a collective scale than biological DNA. For the past 30 years old, I'm being told that my little toe finger is going to disappear because it's useless, or that this whole species is going to stop having a small little toe because it's useless. But I'm not sure it's going to happen one day. The story I've just shared with you isn't one story, but an aggregate of stories juxtaposed via different media and different styles. It's my brother sending me a message to circulate a post that's gone viral, and the Biche Noise inspiring the Chipko, and Esther Duflo writing a children's book and promoting it on a podcast. I made an aggregate of all these stories to make it as one story that I am sharing with you today. And you need all of this repeated enough times over a long period of time for a story to become an integral part of our cultural DNA and for our collective imagination to be transformed. And of course, there's the question of our active participation in all this. What stories to pass on to children, how to pass them on, and what tools to give them so that they can imagine what comes next. Since we have the power to participate in the evolution of our cultural DNA and thus influence our collective evolution, how do we do it? The first tool at our disposal is to learn to master the art of circulation and then pass it on to our children. So you should all have a piece of paper and a pen, and it's now the time when you're going to be able to use your superpower, which is to give a small evolutionary advantage to one story by making it circulate. So I'm now inviting you to write down on this piece of paper a story that is part of your life and that changed you in a significant way, and you'd like more people to know about it. That story can take different shapes. It can be a game, a comic book, a film, a podcast, a film, a concept, an animal, a plant. It can be whatever you want. The constraint you have is that you must have been able to discover it more than a month ago. The aim is to share a story you're surprising yourself in thinking regularly, and then you can create a setting, add a dash of thing that is going to give it a personal level. How did you feel about this story, the emotions you felt, and why do you want it to circulate? The setting is essential because that's where you're expressing your singularity, your uniqueness, so that it then serves the group, the collective level. So to summarize, you can share any type of story. You need to have discovered it more than a month ago. No one is going to check. It's just a suggestion. And you should create a setting to explain why you chose this story. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to share a story about the book that I have gave the most and recommended the most in 2023. The first read of a duology called Story of Moyne and Robot by Becky Chambers. It was very, very beneficial for me, and it takes place in the future where good ideas triumphed and not everything has gone wrong. So Becky Chambers showed me that it's possible to tell a story that is not following the codes of dystopia. It's a world where she invites us to think differently. So if you are sensitive to philosophy, to living matter, and if you're not allergic to science fiction, then I invite you to read it. If I were to share it on a small piece of paper and I didn't have much time, I would do it this way, just to give you an idea. You're free to do whatever you want. You've got a few minutes to think. I know you don't have much time and it's always hard, but let's try. And then a box is going to circulate in the room to collect your papers. You can place them in the box. We'll put the box at the exit, and then you can select a story, a circulation written by someone else, and that might change your life as well.
Right, so Margot is here with a box. So if you want to put your pieces of paper in it, feel free to do so. Otherwise, I'm sure you can put it at the end of this morning session. Maybe you should fold your pieces of paper. Well, doesn't matter. Never mind.
Je vais reprendre, mais vous pouvez continuer à écrire.
Right, so I'm going to continue with my presentation. So the reason I wanted you to do this exercise is because I wanted to show you that if we go through everything we consume on an everyday basis, there's not that many stories that we want to show, to highlight. And also, it's not as easy as it sounds to remember the stories that changed us, because the mass of information we absorb every day can quickly bury everything, even the things that are important to us. So circulation is an active practice that can be learned and requires awareness. And I invite you to share it with children. And as you circulate a story, a conversation can start with others. The original story becomes a medium for building bridges, exchanging ideas, and synchronizing our brains. The stories that we circulate permeate our imaginations and make up our cultural DNA. But loving a story doesn't necessarily mean wanting it to survive the test of time. There's a distinction to be made there. Personally, since I've been using circulation, I've realized that there were many stories that marked me when I was younger, but that I wouldn't recommend today because they put forward values or behaviors that I don't want to contribute to keeping alive in the collective imagination, and that I don't want to pass on to my children. Which brings me to the second tool we have at our disposal to participate in the evolution of our cultural DNA, which is updating the stories we tell. I said earlier on that stories are more powerful than facts. I'm saying now that we need facts to update our stories and make new stories that reflect our realities. So updating our stories is asking ourselves, am I still okay with the dynamics and behaviors highlighted in this story? Am I still okay with the blank spaces and innuendo in this story? And are these statements still valid in the light of what we know today that we might not, that we didn't know yesterday? Updating the facts we share in stories is essential. Every day we discover new information about our universe, our planet, the species that surround us, but also about our past. This new information often modifies what we once believed to be the truth. So updating our knowledge opens up our field of possibilities, enabling us to imagine further, wider, and differently. In many ways, today's stories are nothing like the stories I had access to 20 or 30 years ago. The way stories are told and what is told in stories evolve with us every day organically. But I believe that we can and we must move faster to evolve our cultural DNA towards a different way of telling stories and being in the world. We need to cultivate our ability and the ability of our children to imagine futures other than dystopia. Of course, it's important to be able to imagine how things could go wrong, but we're currently living in an imbalance of narratives. We have an overabundance of narratives pointing to problems and catastrophic scenarios. There's an overabundance of narratives presenting a single pyramidal point of view. So the time has come to reintroduce diversity in the stories that we create, because it's diversity that allows us to unfold. Updating stories is a way to imagine a diversity of futures. And if millions of people improve their ability to imagine diverse futures by 1%, that adds up to a lot more stories and ideas. Let me give you an example of a story that introduces a different way of thinking. In 2010, a team of researchers in Japan asked a single-celled organism that grows in forests and has neither a brain nor a central nervous system to help them optimize Tokyo's rail network. This organism is called Physarum polycephalum. In French, we call it the blob. I don't know, and if anyone knows, please tell me. I don't know how we changed from Physarum polycephalum into blob. I think there's something to be said about this shift, but let's use blob because it's easier to say. So the idea is to find the easiest way to find food in a petri dish. In a petri dish, the teams of scientists recreated Tokyo's railway network, placed small oat flakes at the intersection of each station, and then asked the blob to take on the problem. The blob spread out over the network to reach the oatmeal, and within 24 hours managed to determine the smoothest, most efficient route from one station to the next. The result was very similar to what already existed, just a little bit better. And when you add it all up, when millions of people use a network, it's a lot better. In the story I'm saying, I said that the scientist had asked the blob to demonstrate its skills. I could have said that the scientists had used blob to achieve a result. I chose to update a few words in the story to emphasize what I think is important: collaboration, interspecies collaboration. It's a mere detail, this word that changes, and yet it's the whole power dynamic that is transformed. Which brings me to my final point. The way we tell a story influences the way information is integrated into our cultural DNA. Choosing how we tell the world is choosing the cultural DNA we want to build. For many years now, we've been told that we're living in a war for attention, and that the most effective way to make us react is to make us angry or to make us laugh. And if you've seen a child in front of a screen, you'll have noticed that the best way to win his or her undivided attention is to launch a video. We're told dramatic, scandalous, provocative stories. One of the most widely shared messages across a variety of media is the story of a man with a special destiny who saves his family, his country, his planet, and sometimes even the galaxy. I don't know, you may have heard this story before. The story in the empty space, the undertone we all absorb every time is powerful. If there's only one person with an exceptional destiny who can save the world, is either you or don't bother, someone else will do it for you. The one-upmanship of the extraordinary paralyzes us. overkill in anger or laughter exhausts us. These narrative choices are not taking us where we want to go, i.e. towards a collective improvement in the quality of our lives and life itself. It would even seem that these choices are leading us towards an accelerated destruction of our planet and potentially of our species. I'm not saying that we should stop shocking or making people laugh, or that we should banish stories highlighting our savior complex, but I believe it's time to bring forward stories that value other emotions and behaviors. It's time to reintroduce diversity into our diet of stories. So I suggest using wonder and collaboration to capture attention and get people to react. Whether you're a child or an adult, wonder can be learned. The way we tell the world can activate wonder. And when something or someone is valuable to us, we want to take care of it. To know where the values lie, to learn to see the empty spaces, to activate our wonder, we need story guides, and ideally face-to-face guides. Despite all the technologies we have developed to produce stories on a variety of media, the most powerful medium remains face-to-face orality. That's why I'm here, physically present in front of you, when I could have filmed myself and sent you a video that you could have watched whenever you wanted. But we have decided to meet, physically speaking, all together. So in 2024, we still organize conferences, we're still going to concerts, we're still going to shows. And for some time now, we've even been listening to the recording of live podcasts. Because, why is that? Because feeling the presence of others, collectively respond, seeing each other, being hearing questions, daring to ask a question, amplify the intensity of our neural pairing and therefore the impact of the message we share. Stories are organic technologies that gain in power and fluidity when shared orally and face-to-face. Last story. In 2000, in Copenhagen, Denmark, was created the Human Library. So you go in a library to discover the stories of individuals from a variety of cultures and backgrounds. You can't read those stories. You have to listen to them. Human beings tell you their stories orally and face-to-face. The Human Library now exists in more than 80 countries. Its aim is to fight against prejudice by bringing together people whose lives would not otherwise have crossed. I listen to your story through your words by seeing you. Our brains synchronize, and your story sinks deeper into me. I decide whether or not to pass it on. Either way, I'll participate in the evolution of our cultural DNA. The good news, and I'm not telling you anything new, is that museums are already equipped with guides who teach children to see by talking to them. The system already exists, but can it be strengthened? Because we need guides to teach children, and perhaps especially adults, to question the empty spaces in stories. Maybe also to update stories and to encourage us to circulate stories. Stories give us the power to imagine and co-create the evolution of our species and our planet. If there's only one thing you should take away from our time together, I hope that it is the fact that you have the power to help create our cultural DNA through stories you make up and that you circulate. Thank you very much for your attention and your time.
Tu veux je peux laisser.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Nathalie Sejean. Congratulations. It's not easy to come after you. So, right, we'll take questions from the audience. And I said that already yesterday, but not everyone was there. It is a symposium dedicated to children, but you may have noticed that there's no children present here because they're, usually at school or in crash. So we decided to record 3 kids that I interviewed before this symposium, and I've called them my 3 little guests, and you will hear them from time to time during this conference. And Thelma is circulating a story for Nathalie. So let's hear her. Right, my name is Thelma. I'd like to be a writer. And so I started writing a story. Do you want to tell us the beginning of your story? Yes. It's a young boy who's sitting on his sofa, and this cloud came to take him, and the boy was very scared of flying, and in particular of going down. So the cloud is taking him anyway, and he arrives in a castle of clouds, and little inhabitants get out, and they're much smaller than the boy that is called Akitan. And one is saying, "Oh, there's a giant! Beware!" And the other is saying, "No, I'm not a giant." And the giant says, "Why? And why is that?" And we don't know. And then after, what comes next? Oh, I don't know yet. When I write it, then I know. I don't know if this story is going to be circulated, but we hope it is updated and circulated. That's what we wish for her. So the floor is yours if you want to ask questions to Nathalie. Yes, people, and there's a mic circulated. There's a question up there. Thank you very much for your presentation. That was very rich, very interesting. You highlight the importance of empty spaces in stories. How do you make sure you're conscious of these empty spaces and things that are intended? Well, I think that's the most difficult question. I think it's impossible to cover everything. So I wanted to list all the empty spaces I had to leave, and then in the end I was okay. I had to say that I left this empty space because it means this and that. But it's impossible to list them all. So as we go along, we realize what our biases and the updates we need to make. But for me to realize that these empty spaces exist and to update them, it's just the best way of doing this is to talk about them. And I realized that the easiest method is to share it with other people, and thanks to their way of looking at it, to see empty spaces that we might not have identified. This is why I speak at the end of my presentation. I speak about the time we have and the opportunity we had to talk to one another. I don't know how old you are, but if you were born before 1990, because there was a limited number of stories. For example, my culture is amazing, but on Sunday night there was Dawson on television when I was in high school, and Dawson was something ritual for me. I was looking at one that everyone had looked at this program, and on Monday morning everyone's talking about it, this episode, and so everyone had the same information. What is teenage years? What is it to be a teenager? Who wants to be a filmmaker, etc., etc. So even though in this room everyone's has watched the same show, not everyone has seen it in the same moment of time, the same geopolitical context. So I think if we want to talk about these empty spaces, we need to talk to each other and to share and to pass on stories and analyze them. I think it's very important. If there are people attached to perfection in this room, there's always people attached to perfection. Of course, it will never be perfect, but using updating is a way of updating these empty spaces. I hope this was clear. Do I have to say yes if you can talk or not? Do I have to give you permission? Yeah, okay. Right, I'm Dawson and PC. I loved your presentation. My question is, okay, you talked about cultural items like books and films, but I wanted to know if you had studied clothes. So for kids, they usually play with clothes. I work on pieces of clothes, and so we use garments to create new styles and new pieces. So I wanted to know if you had thought about clothes as a medium to pass on new imaginary worlds. Well, I didn't do it myself, but I like to think that everyone has a function and everyone participates with their own sensitivity to pass on these stories. And I'm pretty sure that many people have been thinking about different things. And I know there's a collective group that I worked with them. It's called They, They, and their work is to think and create non-gender clothes, whether it be in the color or in the shape. And if I'm not mistaken, they're based in Angers, in the Loire region, but that might be somewhere else. Sorry. So they, of course, play on the gender identity. And so in my stories, for example, I think a lot about the character's gender. And so in the play I'm writing, someone is embodying winter, and we call them narrator, in the that includes both the feminine and masculine form, and their clothes reference this both genders. So I'm not a specialist, but I know people who think about it a lot.
Merci pour votre...
Good morning. Thank you for your beautiful presentation. I'm from the same generation as you, so everything you've said resonates a lot. And I work in museums. And I'm a plastic artist, and you talked about certain stories with one hero and one direction in the story. And when I feel in museum that with audio guides you can have the same impact, that there's only one story from one person telling one story about one museum. And in museums, there are very different people who work in mediation who are going to tell different stories. And so my question is the following one. You've given lots of examples, references to films, to blogs, and then all of a sudden you talk about museums. So I'm wondering why you started talking about museums abruptly in your presentation. I'm just intrigued. I'm searching my subconscious level quickly. What I'd say, first thing is that it seems quite natural to talk about museums because we're at the Cité des Enfants. And initially I was asked to talk about the power of stories in this context, a conference on children. So I thought it would be relevant to mention it. And I was told that most people in the audience were working in museums, so that's why it felt relevant to me to talk about that space. I work a lot on in-person orality, and museums are spaces where this continued to take place. And I thought it was important to highlight it. I can't announce to people to work with in-person orality when they already have structures in place. And I remember visiting an exhibition, and I love when people are telling me stories instead of seeing everything without an explanation. I like when a human being is telling me a story. I know that it's limited, that it's personalized, that it's subjective. To me, it seemed relevant to highlight the work that is done, and that if that work is amplified, then it will have even more impact to transform imagination. The work is always done, but then we need to bring awareness on the fact that the work is done. There's time for one last question. Thank you for your presentation that I appreciated. I was moved by the expression you used, a cultural DNA, because at a time when we tend to collect DNAs more and more to show that species on Earth are diverse, with this expression you created a human cohesion around one thing, culture. I'd like you to tell us more about this expression. Thank you. Thank you for asking me this question. This is not an expression I invented. I'm going to name the person who said it for the first time, when I heard it for the first time. It was a cosmologist from the US, Brian Swimme, Swimme. He had a great idea. I don't know why he did it, but I found it great. In the 70s, 80s, he was teaching evening classes on the universe in California. And at the time, he filmed his classes, his evening classes. Put them online, not in the 70s, but nowadays, they're available. He's an incredible storyteller. It's in English. There's no subtitle, but it's available online. He's an incredible storyteller. I don't know why his work hasn't been shared more, but that's him who used that term, DNA, cultural DNA. This shows the biological evolution and the role of human beings. And when he talked about cultural DNA, it was obvious to me that we've got a dual type of DNA that is accelerating our evolution in a much faster way than biological DNA. And what is giving me a lot of energy and what I find intoxicating is that I want to share this message. The DNA is much more something that we can feel, that is hands-on. And so it's a way of understanding that we're not just consumers in a supermarket, but we are people who are creating this decor that is evolving. It's nothing that's still, but a whole range of species. I think we have a lot we can talk about on the specific topic. I want to start this conversation with a specific terminology, so maybe that we can have a common terminology to discuss this. Thank you. Thank you, Nathalie Sejean. A few words, maybe, on where we can find you, follow your work on my website. It's very easy, nathaliesejean.com, nathaliesejean.com. I have one social network, Instagram, on which I share on a daily, regular basis at @Nathalie Sejean. You can find all the stories that are made up. And just one word, the box should be at the exit. And so take one piece of paper. Lots of people have participated, so it should be very interesting. And you're going to discover stories that are probably going to change you. Thank you for your time.
On va passer à la table ronde.